It's time now for the political analysis of Fromm and Fuller. Al Fromm, former political advisor to President Bill Clinton, and Craig Fuller, former political advisor to both Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush. Good morning, all. Al, I do want to talk a little bit today about the election that was held in Ohio a couple of days ago. It looks like by overwhelming majority, Ohio voters turned down a proposal that would make the constitution of that state harder to change, which many in the pro-choice movement saw as a direct threat to reproductive rights. And we've seen this pattern before in Kansas, and it is going to be an interesting issue as we go into the 2024 presidential campaign. What did you make of that, and what are the smoke signals showing us?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very interesting and complicated issue that goes far beyond what the referendum in Ohio was. I mean, the Ohio vote was really a precursor to a referendum on abortion that'll come up in the fall, and the opponents, the people, the pro-life people, wanted to make it harder to change the Constitution because they know a majority of Ohio voters are probably pro-choice. So that's what the issue was on the surface. We saw it in Kansas. You know, whether it had a great effect on the fall election or not, but Kansas did re-elect a Democratic governor in 2022. So it may have had, who I don't believe was favored going in. So you know, it may have had some impact. But I honestly think this is all part of a very much greater, larger struggle that's going on in the country. We've talked about this really a lot over the last 2 or 3 years. The country's changing. And you know, I remember in 1984, one of my first, not one of my first, but an early presidential campaign for me, when Gary Hart came in second in Iowa to Walter Mondale, and he said what I think was one of the greatest lines for framing a campaign. I always knew this campaign would come down to a contest between Vice President Mondale and myself, a contest between our party's past and its future. I think what America is going through now is a fight between its past and its future as it becomes more and more of a multiracial, multicultural, multi-ethnic democracy, and much less homogenous than it's been for most of our history. I think the presidential votes over the last 7 or 8 elections have shown that there's probably a slight presidential majority overall in the popular vote for the Democrats. They have the longest winning streak in the history of American politics, but they haven't won the presidency every time because of the Electoral College and the way the popular vote is distributed across the country. I read a piece this morning by Frank Luntz, or an interview with Frank Luntz, the Republican conservative pollster. And essentially, you know, he said 68% of Republicans are white Christians and 30% of them are evangelicals. That is the part of the country, that is the segment of our population that the country is a sense moving away from, and they're trying to hold on. You see it in a lot of the red states. The old political arrangements, power structures that we all grew up with are rapidly changing. So they're trying to make it harder to pass popular amendments. You want to have a supermajority to change the Constitution. You want to make it harder for new voters to vote. And it's very complicated because issues like the economy, which used to be dominant, are not as dominant anymore. Think about this. 70% of the growth in America are in counties that voted for Biden. The more highly educated college graduates who are now voting overwhelmingly Democratic tend to be in those high growth blue counties. The people who are trying to hold on, working class people, who have felt like they've been left out and falling behind are in the red counties. And while abortion is an issue that it should help the Democrats and does, there are other cultural issues that make it harder: crime, immigration, school curriculum. You know, you have one side trying to keep America like it was, another side wanting to change it. And that's what's really going on in the country. And part of the challenge, I think my party hasn't done a very good job of taking advantage of demographic opportunities. You know, I think to build a coalition, you need to see who your allies can be, and then you need to try to get your allies, even if they don't agree with you 100%, to join with you. And I think many times my party has, on issues like crime and immigration and race and school curricula, been a little too rigid and not accepted the alliance of people who could be our allies in the suburbs. And that's why these elections are still so close. I think what's really happening in the country is you've got this struggle. And the reason Donald Trump has been so successful as a politician, even though, you know, probably all of us would think he belongs in jail rather than in the White House, is because he sort of expresses, even though he doesn't live the values of sort of the white Christian America, he expresses their frustrations and their values. And so they sort of say, okay, well, he may not live it, but at least he's on our side. And that's been very powerful. In any event, I think we're going to see more of these things over the next few years. And as in any transition, you finally will get to the other side. And then you have a new set of issues as the next change comes along.
Frank, what did you learn from Ohio?
I stepped back a little bit and looked at the kind of the abortion issue that's been playing out for the last, let's say, I don't know, year or 2 years. Al is very thoughtful discussion about the changes in the country. I think in some ways it's validated by some of the changes you see if you just look at the abortion question. And, you know, we have to remember that it was the Supreme Court who said, regardless of how you feel about abortion, it ought to be decided at the states, and then indeed the states are working through that. But I think it changed things nationally, maybe more than we've really thought about. And so looking at Gallup, which has tracked 3 questions about abortion since 1975, should it be completely illegal? Should it be available in any situation, or should it be available in some situations? Basically, the 3 areas. Those who say it should be illegal, in all cases, in May of this year, represent 13% of the country. What's interesting about that number is that is the lowest number, with one exception in 1990, the lowest number that Gallup has found since 1975. So this awareness about access to abortion or limits on abortion, is kind of the way I like to frame it, has actually caused people to think differently about making it illegal when you look at their views over the range of decades. Those who say it should be legal under any circumstance are 34%. And that's the highest number since 1975. It touched close to that maybe once, but that's the high water mark since 1975. So again, this awareness of abortion access versus abortion limitations has driven up the number of those who think it should be available in any circumstance. And then in certain circumstances, it's 51%. And it's been between 50 and 60% during this period of time between 1975 and now. But what that says to me is that when the court sent it back to the states, there was a sense that those who wanted to limit access to abortion had a big victory. But the fact of the matter is that is not the attitude across the country. And it seems to me going back to Al's very thoughtful description, the attitudes about abortion are not going to go back to where they were in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s. They're going to be more permissive with respect to access to abortion. Now, the numbers I use are national numbers. It varies by state, to be sure. But again, I think the direction of this is favoring access. What Ohio showed me was that when you put a measure on the ballot that makes it more difficult to amend the Constitution, which is definitely seen as a move to limit access to abortion in that state, when you put that on the ballot, you get an enormous voter turnout. And, you know, I'm from the great state of California, where games have been played with ballot measures for decades there. Regardless of the importance or the significance of the issue, the idea was put something on that ballot that's going to drive voter turnout. Frankly, oftentimes for Republicans. And I think that the message coming out of these states that have seen this on the ballot needs to be that, you know, you may have ambitions to provide limited access for abortion, but you're likely to lose the measure on the ballot, and you're likely to drive out voters who think differently, not just about that issue, but probably about conservative candidates. So the last thing I'd say is in Florida, they've got a petition signing going on. And the folks in Florida, I think, have it right in that their view is this is not a partisan issue. And I think for the good of the country, it ought not to be a partisan issue. It ought to be, thought about. If it's going to be on a ballot, it ought to be voted on based on people's attitudes about that issue. It may have an impact on politics. It may have an impact on campaigns, but the Floridians are anxious to make this a nonpartisan or a bipartisan issue, and I think that's a fairly astute thing to do.
Now, what do you prescribe for the Democrats based on all this?
The Democrats need to take advantage of the two things that I think actually probably will work for them. One, I think the abortion issue does help the Democrats. I mean, it cuts across party lines. Women who are the largest or a larger part of the electorate than men, more aligned with the Democratic position on abortion. We ought to take advantage of that. I think over the next year, the economy will, if not be an advantage for the Democrats, will certainly not be a liability unless it takes a turn back. But then you got to take the next step. The challenge for Democrats in presidential elections is winning those tough swing states and winning in states where you don't always win. So you need allies. And abortion and economic growth are issues that help Democrats in places where they should be the strongest, which are in suburban areas, in areas, high growth areas. And so it's important for the Democrats as they position themselves on issues like crime, on immigration, on school curriculum issues. You don't have to ban books, but you also can, you got to understand where parents are coming from. They don't take positions on those other cultural issues that say, I really just can't go Democratic. It's just, I like where the Democrats are going. They may be pretty good overall, but they just take these positions on crime. I mean, my family needs to be safe. We can't do that. And the great irony is that President Biden represents the part of the Democratic Party, the majority of the Democratic Party, that's actually quite good on issues like that. Mm-hmm. But it's the small minority on what Ruth Teixeira calls the Brahmin left, but of the very progressives who tend to define the Democrats in ways on issues like crime and immigration that say to Republicans, you know, that who are now thinking because of other changes that maybe they ought to consider the Democrats. And no, the Democrats are always like, they're still going to be like the way they used to be. We can't vote for them. I've always believed that an important part of political strategy is not only energizing your base, which is very important, and exciting your supporters, but also cutting your losses in areas that really pull you down. Democrats don't have to win a majority of white working class or Hispanic working class voters. Well, they do Hispanic, but of working class voters overall. But there's a difference between losing them by 20 points and losing them by 5 points. And what part of the parties, and I think Democratic Party's challenge is take advantage of your advantages, but do it in a way that cuts your losses in your weaker areas. Because when you do that, you can put together a majority. And if Democrats did that, I think they could be a governing majority. I mean, look, they've won the presidential popular vote 7 of 8 times. The Biden popular vote election was not even close. It was, you know, it was over 7 million votes, and over 4%. But because so many of the Democratic votes are in California, New York, and Massachusetts, the high growth, high income states, the electoral college is tight. And the strategy I recommend is one that aims at those swing states that decide the electoral college.
Craig, you have the last word this week.
Well, I very much, agree with the points Al made there. I think, the question that, and I've said this before, but the question I think is always most important in the minds of voters is which candidate better understands what confronts me? Who understands my concerns? Mm-hmm. And we're going to send people to the polls next year, starting early in the primaries, but then more importantly, in some ways in November, the general election, that are less aligned with either major party than maybe in our history, certainly in decades. There are just fewer people feel they're either Republicans or Democrats. Interesting column, by the way, by Judge Ludick, who said there is no Republican Party anymore, and thinks that's bad because we need 2 strong political parties. It's a fascinating article, but the fact is that people are less aligned with the parties, and so I think more than ever they're going to go looking for who understands the issues that confront me as a citizen. And in that formula, what again, going back to the original question, in that formula, when you're on the side of social issues that tend to be viewed favorably by a minority, you're going to have a very tough time winning a national election. I even think, as I was describing this, I was thinking, I listened for years that people talk about Reagan being too old to run, then he was too old to get reelected, and of course he won both times. I think that with an improving economy, unless there's some physical issue, the age issue for Biden isn't going to be as great as people think it is. First of all, especially if he's running against, the former president who has issues of all kinds. But the real question is which of these 2 parties is going to field a candidate that great block of voters in the middle understands their concerns and their problems and is prepared to do something about it. And if the economy is improved, if crime is lower in many of these key areas, the very issues that Al talked about, I think will be hard to unseat the incumbent. And I know that Republicans will not unseat the incumbent unless they have a particularly strong candidate, and the current front runner I don't put in that category. But it may just not be possible. It may be if Judge Ludick is right that we really don't have a Republican Party and it's got to be rebuilt, this cycle may be a wash for Republicans, and you know what? Maybe that's what the party needs. Maybe we need to take a real look at what members of this party believe in and the direction it's going, and rebuild it. I think that's a very real possibility.
We have to leave it there. Al Fromm, Craig Fuller, thanks so much. We will see you next week.